Welcome back, everybody, to this session, this plenary session. If you've just joined the platform and you missed this morning's presentation, that will be available soon. But I did want to just briefly do the acknowledgement that I did at the beginning of the conference, which is to acknowledge the land that I'm on. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and also note that this land was stolen and sovereignty was never ceded on the land that I'm on, and perhaps on the land that you are on. If you haven't had a chance already and you feel it's appropriate, please note in the chat the land that you are coming from and pay respects to the traditional owners of that land. I'm super excited about this next session called Friends of Flourishing. We have two friends of ASA online who many members know really well. And the aim of this session that Danny and Patrice pitched was to try and get a more interactive and thoughtful conversation about how we think about flourishing and how we think about flourishing with, in relation with other animals. And so this is a really nice opportunity to think through these problems. Danny and Patrice have talked about this session being more interactive. So getting an opportunity for people involved in this conference to ask questions and express their own views. And of course, as you can see by the wonderful images behind Danny and Patrice, by the way, I'm going to do some intros to Danny and Patrice in a second. This isn't just about flourishing with other humans, but thinking about the others, the non-humans that are in our midst, or the more than humans in our midst. Because of the interactive nature of this session, we're not going to make the recording available. And that's precisely because we want to encourage people to jump on and ask questions. You can ask questions in the chat as we did in the first session. We'll try to filter these through. We may not get through everything because it's a pretty packed session, but we'll try and get through those either as the session is going or at the end of the session. So hopefully you can line up some questions or thoughts as we go along. I wanted to do some introductions. As I said, both Danny and Patrice are friends of ASA, so many of you know them, but I feel like I should do some introductions to start. Danielle Selamai is a professor of sociology and social policy at the University of Sydney and acting director of the Sydney Environment Institute, and also lead of the Multi-Species Justice Project that we heard about in the last session. Her publications include Sins of the Nation and the Ritual of Apology, that's out with Cambridge, and The Prevention of Torture, an Ecological Approach, which is also out with Cambridge. Through the experience of living through the Black Summer bushfires as part of a multi-species community, she began writing about a new crime of our age, omnicide, which some of you may have heard this term that Danny coined. Her latest book, and I should say brilliant book, if you haven't read it, I recommend it, is Summertime, and that was released in 2021. And it was written in recognition of the critical urgency of conveying the complex conceptual recognition of the multi-species harms of the climate catastrophe in ways that can provoke affect and action. Patrice Jones is co-founder of the amazing Vine Sanctuary, an LGBTQ-run farmed animal sanctuary that works within an ecofeminist understanding of the intersection of oppressions. Vine was the first sanctuary to develop a method for rehabilitating roosters used in cockfighting. And Patrice has written and spoken extensively about the uses of roosters and other animals in the social construction of injurious ideas about gender. Vine has also taken the lead in queering animal liberation, organising dozens of events and publications on the intersections between speciesism and homophobia, dating back to 2002. Located in a predominantly white rural region devoted to dairying, Vine includes anti-racist efforts in its local campaigns. Vine also works frequently with scholars and has made it a priority to bridge the gap between academia and activism. And I should say that Vine needs no introduction to many people in animal studies, because this is the sanctuary most animal studies scholars speak about. Prior to founding the sanctuary, Jones was a social activist using a wide variety of tactics in a wide range of movements dating back to the 1970s. As an eco-feminist scholar, Jones has authored 2 books, The Oxen at the Intersection and Aftershock, Confronting Trauma in a Violent World, as well as numerous contributions to edited collections, including a collection that is well known to Acer folk, Animalities or Animaladies, which came out in 2018. Depends who you are and how you choose to interpret the title name. I'm going to now hand over to Patrice and Danny. I'm going to disappear into the background and I'll let our hosts take control of this session from here. Welcome, Danny and Patrice.
Thank you. I don't know about control. I think it might be out of control. We'll take out of control of the session. Thank you. Hi, everybody in YouTube land. We can't see you, but we wish we could. Maybe, Patrice, shall I just acknowledge where I am and then you acknowledge where you are and then we can bring our friends along? How does that sound?
Or you can acknowledge where you are and tell your story, and then I'll acknowledge where I am and tell mine.
Okay. So I would like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Dharawal and the Yuin people, to thank elders past, present, and everybody else for the care that they have taken of the kinship relations in which they recognise themselves as being embedded, and that type of care and love and respect and justice that has made it possible for the multi-species community within which I now live to flourish as best we can. So as you can see from the people who are here with us, Patrice and I wanted to have as many different people be part of this session. So even though there are 2 human animals here, this session is brought to you by us and our friends with whom we consulted on what we ought to say. So I'm going to start by talking about Gabriel, who you can see up here on my right, and Wookie, who you can see down here on my bottom right. So Gabriel came here after a pretty difficult life. He started his life in a zoo on the south coast of New South Wales. And he navigated his way out of the zoo by developing what for him was a very adaptive form of behaviour. He came to learn very quickly that small hands attached to human children often carried sweet and yummy things. And so Gabriel would preemptively grab those hands. From the point of view of the human zookeepers, this was maladaptive behaviour. And so they quickly got rid of him. The next chapter of his life was also one of use. So donkeys are extremely loving and caring animals, and they also live a long time relative to many other equines. So Gabriel became the carer of a number of horses, and he would become very close to those horses and develop really loving bonds with them. And then the horses would eventually die, and Gabs would go into the very deep grief of losing a friend. He ended up with a human being who recognised the abuse of that grief. And so when his last horse friend, Shirano, was coming close to dying, this human animal contacted us because knew that there were a bunch of donkeys living here and said, could Gabby come and live there as well? So that's how Gabby ended up here. So I'm going to move now to Wookie before I bring them together and talk about their relationship. So Wookie was actually here when we got here. So he was a resident before the current human residents. And he was in his early 20s when we got here. And he had quite a bad hip injury, which is really evident on his body. And I believe that he had been used as a polo pony. And so this must have been a crash that left him with that injury. He also had very serious eye problems and has gone through a number of treatments because he gets ulcers in his eyes. And now he is completely blind. But remarkably, this is a large area of land where they live, and it's very hilly and there are lots of forests. But he has an embodied understanding of the land, and he moves through the land as if he is fully sighted. He knows where to go, he knows how to move, he knows how to navigate everything. And of course, his horse friends are very intimately involved in that knowledge. So he hears them, he smells them, he moves with them. But increasingly, he's coming to spend time by himself in places where he feels particularly at home. So when Gabriel arrived, having spent his life with horses, I, assuming that I knew what was best for him, immediately assumed and put him to hang out with the other donkeys. I thought, this is the opportunity that you've been waiting for. You now get to hang out with a bunch of donkey friends. Well, Gabriel had a very, very different view of things. He was not interested in hanging out with the donkeys at all. As far as he was concerned, he belonged in the horse community, and that was where he was going to go. So to paraphrase my colleague Tom Van Duren, I had to abdicate my position as host, or as my friend Ariane Wallach, who's going to be speaking on Thursday, puts it in not quite so polite or esoteric terms. Who the hell told you that you were God, right? So I had to get out of the God position. And there's a wonderful paper that I would really recommend to people here that our friend Katie Gillespie has written recently, called The Unthinkable Politics of Multi-Species Flourishing Within and Beyond Colonial Capitalist Ruins. And she points out in that paper that if we pay attention, other animals themselves are always crafting, and I quote her, ways of knowing what constitutes the conditions of flourishing. So when I stepped back, Gabby, who I now think of as the trans donkey, found his unique place moving between these two communities, who also have a community amongst themselves. And that was not just on his terms, of course, it was a negotiation, because these communities have their existing dynamics and they recalibrated as he came in. And it's been really remarkable to step back and watch him occupy these two communities in very unique ways. And then a few weeks ago, something really remarkable happened when Patrice and I were already thinking about what we wanted to talk about. And that was, I looked over very early in the morning and I saw Gabby and Wookie playing. And I have never seen Wookie play. Wookie is, is about 30. He's completely blind. The two of them were jumping on each other, biting each other. It was pretty sexual. It was really beautiful. It was really full on. And that was just this remarkable experience to be able to witness that. And also to realise that Wookie's probably going to die pretty soon, and to wonder what that's going to mean for Gabby, who has been through these repetitive cycles of losing a loved one, but this time in the context of a much more extended community that he will navigate. So before I hand over to Patrice, I just wanted to say a few things that I've learned about flourishing by watching these particular people. First is that flourishing rests in relationships, not in individuals, and relationships that are formed through negotiation. Everybody needs time to work them out, and flourishing is not something that can be given. Certainly not given by a human animal. It's something that people find for themselves in place, in landscape, in relationship. Second, that flourishing is always in flux. It's always changing. It's not about being, it's about becoming. And that it's a mutual, it's within what we might think of as not the Darwinian dynamic of competition, but the Margolian dynamic of mutualism. And finally, and this is probably a great place to hand over to Patrice, flourishing is about desire. You know, Wookie and Gabby are full of desire, and it happens that their desires are mutualistic and can weave together in a way that supports both of their flourishing. So that's my first story. So I'm going to hand over to you, Patrice.
Thank you, Danny. And hello, everyone. I am here in what is now called Vermont in the USA, which is the unceded traditional homeland of the Abenaki people, as well as numerous indigenous animals, including beavers and wild turkeys. It's night and it's winter, so I encourage all of you to enjoy daytime and warmth, and to imagine that most of the friends who I consulted as we were thinking about what we would say are, well, the bird friends are all asleep, cuddled up together. I don't know if you know that sometimes chickens sing to each other at night. And the cows are probably asleep, but one thing you might not know is that cows sleep for a bit, then get up and wander around, sleep for a bit, then get up and wander around. Our barns are open, so they can leave to do that whenever they like, and you're welcome to imagine cows mooing in the moonlight. As I tell the story of the person who first came to my mind when I thought, well, who here might be someone whose story of flourishing would be interesting or fruitful, and it wouldn't even matter if I could think of a reason, because I love autumn. And so I'm going to talk with you about a cow called Autumn, who is over this shoulder in the center of two other cows. They're all walking, and we'll talk about that walking in a minute. In order to make this background go right, I had to tell Zoom to stop mirroring me. So I'm slightly uncomfortable because I'm appearing backwards to myself, but actually one of the things I want to say about flourishing is that it might require some discomfort on our part. And so I'm enduring that discomfort so that you can see Autumn in her accurate orientation. Autumn came to Vine Sanctuary at age, after spending 12 years in a dairy, during which time 9 cows were taken from her. None of us can imagine. She was let go because she had chronic mastitis, which is an infection of the mammary glands, and but they had continued milking her even with that. But the thing that made them let her go was her udders were so big that they almost dragged on the ground, and so she had actually stepped on one of her teats and crushed it. It was actually years of treatment before we got rid of the infection. She came with a cow called Rose, and Rose seemed very shy, but it turned out she was sunk in depression. Autumn, on the other hand, looked you right in the eye. Like, okay, who are you? And what are you planning? And now, years later, Autumn, she's the eldest cow here. She's 19, and she and Rose are the co-leaders of the part of the sanctuary called the Commons, which I'm going to talk with you about later. Autumn is the matriarch, the one who enforces the rules, and Rosie is the emotional leader of the flock, the herd, the multi-species aggregation that is them. But the thing that two things I wanted to tell you about how flourishing has manifested for Autumn. First, she was here for several years. And oftentimes calves would come in. She was always very kind with calves, always played with calves, but never took a particular interest in calves. And then about 3 years ago, a calf called Gemini arrived, and Autumn adopted him. I mean, adopted him. I mean, seriously decided that he was her calf, protected him, bathed him to the extreme. During the time when he was so small that he did have to sleep in a stall at night, would sleep right outside of it and moo at us to let him out first thing in the morning. She then continued to parent him, and so you can see him, he's the brown calf beside her. And then there's another calf called Shasta, who was his friend. And so Autumn, by then elderly, she had been down 3 times. Going down for calves can be deadly. They have to stand up in order to digest. And so during the times when she was down, we would actually have to lift her by tractor several times a day until she got her legs back under her. She was a quite old person, and yet here she was chasing after these kids. And you could just, sometimes Rose would take over babysitting, and you could just see Autumn was like, phew, okay, I need a break from these children. So we thought that once Gemini grew up and moved to the back pasture, which I'll be telling you about soon, Autumn was clearly like relieved, like the parent whose child has finally gone off to college. And can get a break. And so we thought this was it for her. Calves came, she showed no interest. And then this summer, a calf called Mocha came from another dairy, and she has adopted him again. I cannot begin to tell you what it means to us. To just imagine what it must mean like to her to be able to actually raise a calf and know that no one will be interfering with that relationship with that calf. But that's not actually the flourishing that I wanted to tell you about for Autumn. I wanted to tell you about the moment that I really knew for sure that Autumn was flourishing here. And it was a day when somebody new had come. And if you know cows, then you know that cows are very friendly. Cows here are always so happy when someone new comes. The trailer comes rolling up the driveway, and they presume that whoever is coming is going to be a friend. The happiness starts before the trailer is even open, before they even see what species this person who has arrived might be. So someone new had arrived. I don't even remember who now. And the cows were galloping in figure eights of glee around the pasture. And the younger ones were literally kicking up their heels with happiness. And I was watching all this when I happened to catch a sight of Autumn, who had only very recently been down and was way too infirm to be galloping. And what she was doing was dancing a little jig with a tree, dancing in circles around a tree. And so I wanted to tell that story as my first story of a friend, as we begin to think about how we can be friends of flourishing, to highlight just how queer flourishing can be, because I think it doesn't get queerer than dancing with a tree. something that I know I enjoy very much.
I just have to say, one of the things I so love about you, Patrice, is the way that you just become completely infused with the joy of the friends that you are talking about. It's so beautiful. So I think now we're going to do a bit of talk. And Patrice, I wanted you maybe to say a few words about why does flourishing matter? And then I'll say a few words about why I think flourishing matters.
Okay, and thank you for humoring me when I decided to call this part talk on our outline.
She actually called it ABC talk.
Okay, so for me, I have 4 reasons in my mind why flourishing matters. First, flourishing happens. Flourishing happens in the world. Flourishing is, as we'll see when I get to number 2, essential to the larger than human world. And so to ignore flourishing or to perseverate upon other human preoccupations without due attention to flourishing would be to have a falsely blinkered idea of the larger than human world. Second, I think, okay, so for me, when I think of flourishing, the word in English came to us by means of Old French from the Latin for flowering. And for me, flourishing and flowering, the same. Flowers flourish in their inflorescences, and I hope that feels as good to do as it feels for me to say. And quiet as it's kept, all of us animals are absolutely dependent on plants. And so what this means is that we are dependent on flourishing. It's not some extra. Flowering is what makes our lives possible and the lives of all animals possible. Without plants, there's no people, there's no other animals, and without flowering, there's no plants. So flourishing is essential for that reason. In my heart, I feel a flowering when I observe flourishing, or what seems to be flourishing. We'll talk about mistakes in thinking about flourishing later. And that feeling, as Danny said, flourishing is all about desire, but there's also this desire to feel that flourishing feeling of not just your own flourishing, but of others. And that can be super motivating and give you the energy that you need to maybe be a friend of flourishing. And I think if we think really, really hard about what flourishing might be, and really, really carefully about what flourishing might be, if we try to imagine what flourishing might be, then that process of imagination will be, of course, yes, inspiring, but also instructive, and actually help us to imagine what it is we're trying, what different world, what world we're trying to participate in, and maybe have more accurate strategies. So that's for me.
Well, that's cool. I haven't got a lot to add to that, because that's your fluorescent flourishing flowers that flow through you are pretty much the whole story. But I guess I'd just add to that, when you're talking about being able to imagine what it might be like, it makes me think of my friend and colleague Matthias Thaler found this very obscure lecture of Octavia Butler's that I've really hooked onto, where she talks about 3 types of utopias: the what if, the if only, and the if this goes on. So the if this goes on is the dystopian one, so we're going to put that to the side. The what if is the one that defamiliarizes what's been normalized, right? Like, what if the world was like this, so that we can see that what seems necessary, what seems entrenched, actually is contingent and could be otherwise. But the if only one, which I think is the closest to the one that you're talking about, is the one that helps us shift the landscape of our feelings, right? It's this embodied affective space, not just a cognitive process of what might it look like or how we might order it differently, but to really bring us into a different space of feeling. And, you know, as Dinesh said in his opening remarks, it's very difficult not to become flooded with the dominance of extractive capitalism and violence, and particularly in an age of climate catastrophe. But it's so important to connect back, like to hook our lives back into these spaces of difference that have always existed, that there have always been, even in what feels like a saturated system, there are always people, human people, other people who are not just resisting, but who are living otherwise, who have their own forms of life and their own ways of being. And these sites of difference and flourishing, I think, is such an important ground for us to stand on when the ground can feel so unstable as it does now, and bad unstable. There's good unstable as well. So should we like go to our next stories, maybe? What do you think?
Oh, yes, you were going to talk about Jimmy, who so many people know.
Yeah, I was going to talk about Jimmy, and I saw that in chat. Rebecca had asked a question about grief. So here we are. So Jimmy is, I hope you can see Jimmy, but appropriately, Jimmy is up here on my left. And I say appropriately because he is completely in his world, which is what I am going to talk about. So Jimmy and Kate were brother and sister, and they began their lives in the deathscape of an industrial farm. And they were taken from that deathscape by some activists. And then their first home was with a human who recognised how tenuous their grip on life was. They had been marked for death. And I think what kept them alive very early, although I wasn't present to that early part of their lives, but I've seen images of it, was they literally clung together, the two of them. They slept together. They held each other. And when they came here because that human person was no longer able to offer them a place to be. And they came here, and I made all sorts of mistakes when they first came here because I'd never lived with pigs before. But Jimmy in particular was a pretty good teacher. And the one non-mistake we made was that we didn't prevent them from occupying a large space and a very varied space with a forest and lots of different places to go. And Jimmy in particular was very committed to building his world. I like to think of Jimmy as the finest engineer and architect who has ever lived here. And he went into his world and he found all sorts of places that had particular light in particular times of the day or seasons under trees. So there were winter places and there were summer places and morning places and afternoon places. And like autumn, he had his particular trees that he liked to hang out in. I never saw him dance with a tree, but I would not be surprised if that didn't happen. But that type of variety, and so that he could make choices about where he wanted to be, was really important to him being able to then take that very active role in creating his world. As many people know, because you might have heard me tell the story and I've also written about it, at the end of 2019, as the catastrophic fires were getting closer and closer to where we live, we decided that, the humans decided that all of the animals, including us, needed to get out of here. And Jimmy and Kate went back to spend some time with the person who had originally lived with them. 20/20 vision is what you get with hindsight. 3 days later, that place was immolated by a catastrophic fire on 3 sides. Katie was killed in that fire, and Jimmy, we assumed in the first instance that he was killed because he just didn't turn up and everything was blackened. But 36 hours later, he turned up. He had, who knows what he did. I'm guessing that he went into a dam or the like, but he survived. When he came, when we couldn't get there for 7 days because all the roads were closed. When we brought him home, there was no one here. All of the other animals were still evacuated. And after an initial moment of being overjoyed to be home, to be able to put himself back in his mud bath, to be able to lie in his land, he went into a very deep grief, a grief at the death of Katie and the trauma of having lived through this unimaginable terror of the fire. And that was a real challenge for us in trying to think about what did it mean to support his flourishing under these conditions of grief and trauma and illness as well. What did it mean to care for him? And what we learnt, because he told us, was that it was this dance between offering and retracting. So Jimmy would come to us, but then he would leave. And what he did over and over again was he took himself to the earth. He took himself to these places that he had created. And he took himself, and this was something that I learned by going and sitting where he took himself, was he took himself to an earth that was not shattered by anthropogenic violence, where, you know, you can imagine the fire came at 8 o'clock in the morning. So to go back to Patrice, you know, you were asking us to imagine the winter and the cows looking at the moon. Imagine 8 o'clock in the morning in summer and it's black, it's pitch black. And the noise is like being under a train, it's that loud. And the smell and the taste that completely infused his body. So every sense assaulted. And Jimmy took himself to a different earth, to an earth where the wind was still moving through the trees and where he could hear the river and the birds. And that's what he did. And our job was to make that as possible, which often, as you said, Patrice, involved getting out of the way. 18 months later, so Jimmy recovered, and then he went on to what we called the lily pig, because he used to love going and visiting and eating the lilies. 18 months later, so just 3 months ago, he became suddenly very sick, and it was evident that he was dying. I think that he was dying from whatever happened to him during the fires. And it seems oxymoronic to ask what flourishing in death looks like, but death is part of being mortal, of being alive. And so I wanted to think a little bit with Jimmy about what flourishing in death meant. And again, it meant being with the earth and being with his trees and placing himself in the earth. And again, Jimmy taught me that partly through my mistake, which was about a week after he became very sick. He hadn't drunk, he wasn't drinking. We were very afraid that he was going to die of dehydration, which is a terrible, terrible death. And so we decided to take him to hospital. And we got him onto a float, and the hospital 3 hours away was waiting for him to arrive. We were all, set to go in our human program. This is the program, this is what we're doing. And I looked down at him, and this magnificent giant being had shrunk right down into himself. And it was as clear as anything has ever been to me that this was not flourishing for him, that this was not the right thing to do. And so we opened the float door, he turned around and he walked back into his world. And what I realized was that I had thought that you could abstract Jimmy from his world and support his life, but you couldn't abstract Jimmy from his world. It was his world. It was his place. It was his place of living. It was his place of being sick. It was his place of healing. And it was his place of dying. So Anna Singh, in her wonderful book, Mushroom at the End of the World, writes about how in capitalism, in the world of commodification, beings are torn from their life worlds so that they can become commodities. And this was just the opposite. This was Jimmy saying, this is my world. This is the web of flourishing, of flowing, in which my living and my dying belongs. And so that particular being taught me what I didn't think was actually possible to learn, which was about flourishing in death. So that's Jim.
I feel like I want to pause from our plans for a moment, because I know we can't be the only ones feeling something right now. And I'm remembering I was having a conversation with your student Darren Chang, the fabulous Darren Chang,
Hi, Darren.
who may be listening, and he asked me something about whether it was possible for people who live at sanctuaries to flourish themselves within, all of the grief. And I wasn't sure, but then I remembered, as you say, flourishing is always flux. It's not like it's some steady state that we can be in. But I had an experience, you know, here at the sanctuary where we got together for a meal last week, and another student, someone who's visiting, a scholar who's visiting right now, Pablo, who may be listening in, was noticing how much we laughed. And I think, you know, finding, and it occurred to me that laughing is a kind of flourishing, because it's a kind of flourish. It's not a humor is a kind of flourish. And I was thinking, yeah, that's how we survive, by seizing every opportunity to have minutes of flourishing or moments of flourishing. But I do think that this is the question before us, you know, how to be friends of flourishing, and understanding that in the current context of late consumer capitalism and climate emergency, that we're talking about flourishing within unspeakable, unbearable grief. And so I guess I just want to acknowledge yours and that of all the people we can't see who are listening, many of whom I'm sure are having their own memories.
Yeah, I think that's that notion of emotional flux is very important, right? It's not, we move through, and some of what we move through is unspeakable grief, and there will be no flourishing in those moments. They can feel like dying when you lose someone you love very deeply, and I think it's really critical not to overlook that. Thank you.
Also, I just heard autumn crowing, I think.
Yeah, I have an autumn. We have an autumn here as well. Autumn is a queer rooster, and he is out there crowing. Yes.
So now I'll move us back onto our outline, if that's okay. And the thing that struck me so much about the story of Jimmy is your acknowledgement of his situatedness, the situatedness of his flourishing, and so and what I noticed when I was saying, okay, so what stories am I going to tell from Vine? We said it would be Danny and Patrice and friends. Which is that, okay, so we're going to be bringing specific friends, and I thought of Autumn, and I thought of Domino, who I'm going to talk about toward the end. But what I found was that I was making lists of places within Vine, sub-places within Vine Sanctuary, that for me are sites of flourishing. So I'm just going to talk about a few of those. And then we'll see where that takes us. Up, okay, at the top where you see some cows in trees. I can't point it myself because I'm backwards. There we go. There, the cows in trees. That's our back pasture, where who we call the hardy herd of around 30 cows. Manage their own community. The people, the humans come by twice a day to count heads, make sure everybody looks okay, make sure there's food, make sure that there's clean water in the troughs, make sure the barn is clean, though sometimes we don't have to clean it because sometimes they don't even use the barn. When the weather's fine, they are sleeping out in the trees. We won't even see a hoof print in the barn. They're drinking from brooks. Of course, we put out hay, but they're foraging. And I chose the photo that I chose there because the cow in the center is Maddox. And I don't know if you can see his dignity. But what I've noticed among the cows in the hardy herd, who again manage their own affairs, and I think live lives that are as close as could be possible to the Eurasian herbivores from whom cows were descended. They manage their own community. They have their own relationships. Our rule in general is that we truly respect self-determination, and so we don't interfere unless it's absolutely necessary for the health or well-being of either the animal themselves or another animal at the sanctuary. But what I noticed when there were two cows, Pancho and Jasper, who had come to us as calves, and when I met them, they were adolescents and just about to graduate into the hardy herd. And so I knew them when they were playful adolescents / young adults. Pancho was the trickster, Jasper was the brains of the duo, always getting into trouble. Clearly juveniles. Then they moved to the back pasture. They were still just young adults. And a couple months later, I walked to do the morning cow count and I encountered Pancho. And what I saw in his posture, in his energy, in the way that he looked at me, was a dignity that hadn't been there before. And while of course I can't prove this, it seemed to me that this wasn't just because he had aged a few months, but this was because he was participating as a young adult in a self-organized community and had regained something that we call dignity that is often denied to other than human animals, even in the best of circumstances, even in sanctuaries. The back pasture is abutted by Vine Sanctuary, is the owner of a lot of acres, and I forgot to look up how many hectares it is so that it would be clear, but it's 100 acres for those who know acres, and we occupy only half of it. The rest we protect from hunters by walking the lines and posting no hunting signs, but otherwise leave alone. And that is occupied by beavers, by turkeys, and deer, and numerous other animals. And I think it's a site of flourishing. I know that the Beaver Dam just over our property, which is also not interfered with by the people who own that land. It's a astronomical observatory, and there's just a common understanding that no one will mess with the Beaver Dam. I mention this just because, again, sometimes what we can do to be friends of flourishing is get the hell out of the way. If we walk downwards from the back pasture, then we'll come to an area that some scholars have called the commons, and now we call the commons. We used to call it the front barn, but then Sue Donaldson and her amazing team came to Vine, observed, wrote some papers, and identified this part of the sanctuary as the commons. And as you can imagine, from that word, there are a lot of people of a lot of different species in the commons. So there are cows and goats and sheep and alpacas, and how many different kinds of birds, chickens and turkeys and geese and ducks and guinea fowl, emus, and I know I'm forgetting some people. One pig. I feel like the commons is a kind of is a site, is a community that flourishes, but it's a really different thing than the flourishing of the back pasture. Whereas, as we said, we have mostly cows. The wild turkeys visit them. There's a quail who loves to hang out with them. We've seen deer eating with them at the hay ring. There are coyotes. many other wild animals. But for the most part, they hang out with each other, living a life, as I said, that's I hope, pretty close to their ancestral lives. Whereas in the commons, ain't nobody living anything close to their ancestral lives, given the admixture of species who are all figuring out how to get along through, as Danny said, a process of negotiation. But it's a different kind of flourishing. Individuals may or may not be flourishing. This is where our elders live, and this is where if cows are injured, they live. And so there are people in the community who are not flourishing at the moment, who are ailing at the moment, who are dying at the moment. And yet I feel that the community is the entity that is flourishing within the commons. And within that flourishing community, there's a happiness. Sue Donaldson and her team pointed out, that, so there's a every twice a week, we have great loads of donated vegetables from a local grocery store that we distribute. And when it's time to give those out, it's a festival. Everybody comes. And what Sue and her team noticed, and this is why sanctuaries should let scholars come, because they will notice things that you didn't even notice. What they noticed is that the alpacas would come and join the fun even when they weren't interested in eating the vegetables, just to be part of the party feeling when it's Hannaford's Day in the commons. So that's the commons. Then behind me, if I move out of the way, so you see a bunch of birds, a bunch of chickens roosting in a fallen tree. That's the part of the sanctuary that we call the valley. And that is most like our original sanctuary, which for the first 9 years was just a sanctuary for chickens, literally surrounded by factory farms in which chickens were held captive. When we first took in chickens, we thought to ourselves, how shall we do this? And then we decided, oh, and I should say, it's not like we said, oh, we're going to go out and save chickens. It's that we found a chicken by the side of the road who had jumped off a truck headed for the slaughterhouse, and then found more and more and more. And then I went into a factory farm, and I guess that was a rescue of some. So Miriam Jones and I decided that what our motto would be let birds be birds. And the idea was that people don't even think of chickens as birds, but they're birds. Well, what kind of birds are they? So we looked up their heritage. What would they like? Well, trees, brush. They're descended from the jungle fowl of South Asia. They're jungle birds. They don't want bare yards with mowed grass, although that's what most people imagine would make chickens happy, and what many sanctuaries set up for chickens. But chickens are jungle birds. They want foliage. They want places to perch. They want places to hide from predators. Won't their bodies be happier when they're not having to worry that there's a predator in the sky that they can't hide from? Yes, they will be, I believe. And so we have a flourishing community of mostly chickens, although not exclusively, in the valley. And in the valley is another place of flourishing, which was sort of accidental. So one part of the yard, one of the yards in the valley had become barren from being raked too often and chickens walking all over it and the scratching, etc. And so in order to help the chickens to flourish, some volunteers came and we transplanted some of the mint that was growing elsewhere from on the sanctuary into that barren area, moving the roots and then covering them with heavy rocks all around them so that the chickens couldn't scratch them up before they grew. And it worked. and the mint grew, and that was beautiful because mint not only gave the chickens shade, but is beloved by bees and butterflies both. But the most amazing thing that happened was that the next year the mint made way for motherwort, which is a so-called weed, also a medicinal herb, and very beloved by bees. And so now there's this whole part of the valley that is a bee flourishing community. I mean, we try for the whole property to plant pollinators, to not mow weeds, etc. But I cannot communicate to you what it's like to walk out on a summer morning. The buzzing of the bees is so loud. There are multiple bees on every plant, and there are so many plants. And it's this beautiful, flourishing entity that is plants and insects together, and that arose accidentally in the course of trying to promote chicken flourishing. And then the final point of flourishing that I want to mention is a willow tree, the origins of which I will skip in favor of time, but is used by blue jays and woodpeckers, and I don't know how many wild birds. And I think of it as a commons. I can see it out my window. Squirrels. One time I saw a squirrel eating some of the bird food that I put out, so I help with the community. And then I heard a bird give an alarm cry. And the squirrel ran away because squirrels listen to the alarm cries of birds. And then the bird just hopped down. So there was some trickery involved in the community. But the best example that I had, that maybe this really is a commons in the way that we think of it, was when a robin was nesting in a pine tree right next to the willow tree. And she had a new nest. It was spring. And I was looking out the window one day and I saw her come out and yell at a blue jay and make the blue jay go away. And I'm thinking to myself, hey, no, that's not okay, because this tree is a commons. Like, your nest is over there. This tree is a commons. You shouldn't be scaring another bird away. And as I was thinking that, a cardinal flew up, scolded the robin, who then went back to her nest. And I really feel sure that the cardinal was saying something along the lines of, this tree is a commons and no one is allowed to try to be the boss of it. So that brings up the negotiation that Danny was talking about. The other thing that I think of, not just negotiation, but care and empathy. This morning when I was doing morning chicken chores, I had to step through some birds who were all around my feet. And as I was lifting my foot to very carefully step down, I suddenly flashed to a former resident of the Commons called Scotty, a giant cow, who used to take the most exquisite care to never step on a bird. And it occurs to me that it wasn't just care, but empathy. He had to know that the chickens would be scared of him in order to move as slowly as he did, not just to avoid stepping on them, but to avoid scaring them. So there's negotiation, but I think there's also care and there's also empathy in building a community of flourishing. And all of those communities actually happen in physical places. And I'm sorry if I went on too long for that.
Well, what a lively community. So Patrice, I'm aware that we've got lots of people who are saying things. So maybe I'll just very quickly say a couple of words about lyrebirds and then hand back to you. I can skip Aristotle. I'm sure everyone would love that. Or say a couple of words about Aristotle. But I just want to say a word about lyrebirds. And firstly, I did not acknowledge that the visual presence of Friends is thanks to the artist Patrice Jones, who created both of our backgrounds. And this is completely unashamed theft that I'm about to do from Patrice, because this is her move. But given that she gave me the scenario, the lyrebird that I'm about to talk about is, as Patrice says, if you decenter the human, then marvelous things happen. So that's the lyrebird behind me. And the reason I'm going to talk about the lyrebird is because Patrice asked me a tricky question, and I think it's important to talk about tricky questions as well. So, we've been talking a lot about these entangled relations of earth and bees and different sorts of trees and plants and flowers and all sorts of people and the way in which they support each other's lives. And I don't think there's any more poignant materialization of that than the lyrebird. So lyrebirds, many of you will know, their songs are literally the gatherings of the places where they live. So all the sounds, but the sounds in relationship with each other. So I'm very lucky. I live where there are lots of lyrebirds. And so when I go out in the morning or in the afternoon, I'll hear these oral gatherings of the places where the lyrebirds are hanging out. So the satin bowerbirds, the yellow-throated scrub wren, the black cockatoos, and all moving through the particular trees that are here, the wattles, the old man banksias, the eucalypts, all of the rainforest ferns, and so on. But, as some of us know, lyrebirds are also famous for making these other sounds, like the sounds of cameras or the sounds of chainsaws or the sounds of excavators. And Patrice asked me, because I've written a little bit about this, can that also be flourishing? Can this lyrebird, who is expanding their repertoire of expression to include the novel, we might even call it the unnatural, can that be flourishing? And I don't really have an answer to that question, but we thought it was worth posing. And my tentative thought on it is that I would think that the outer edges of what we might think of as queering our relationships, adapting to the novel, the outer edge of where it can still count as flourishing is where what is entering in that community is hostile to the conditions of mutualist life. So literally the chainsaw cutting down the trees, which are the ground of being for all of these other beings. So to take that back to Wookie and Gabriel, the desire of the chainsaw or the desire of the ones who are wielding the chainsaw is incompatible with the desire of the lyrebird and everyone else who lives there. So I think that's an interesting question to ask in worlds where conditions are often full of interference, full of pressing up against the patterns of community that beings have had for centuries or millennia. What are the outer edges of flourishing within that? So I'm going to hand back to you. I think you want to talk about another bird who combines.
I won't for long because I won't for long. So I'll just note that I made a grave mistake in relation, not a grave mistake because I didn't hurt anybody. It was just a grave mistake in my head where I became very, very concerned that a bird who was singing the most beautiful and elongated tune that I'd ever heard, and entirely, I'd never heard it before. And so I and other people at the sanctuary, we became concerned that this was a lost bird or a bird who had come to a new territory, perhaps due to climate change, and was all alone and was singing their heart out. for some partner who would never come because we'd never heard such a glorious song. But then it just turned out to be a catbird doing what lyrebirds do, which is making up new songs from their environment. And that reminded me of the ways that we can go wrong. And so Danny is not going to tell us that Aristotle was all wrong, because we already know that.
Very, very, very quickly. I just wanted to say that even though I anticipate that during this conference, people are going to be extremely creative in the way that they think about flourishing, I just thought it's important because sometimes the traditions in which we're interpolated, particularly those of us who are trained in the academy, they seep through our thinking. And the word flourishing entered contemporary philosophy or political theory as a translation of Aristotle's term eudaimonia, which used to be translated as happiness or well-being. And I just thought it was important to say that there are two things about Aristotle's concept of flourishing that I think we really need to put on the table, and hopefully everything that we've said has illustrated why we think they're problematic. One is that apart from Athenian men, free Athenian men who were self-creating, everyone else was kind of on these railroad tracks of this is what it is to be a being, this is what it is to be a donkey, or this is what it is to be a chicken. And flourishing means realizing your telos, as opposed to this much more open-ended set of possibilities. And the second is that in that tradition, it's individuals that flourish. It's not communities, it's not relationships. And so even though I'm assuming that everybody's already thrown that out, I just thought it's important to, because that word is at the center of our conference, just to expose some of those assumptions that are built into it. That's all I need to say. Do you want to talk a little bit about Pablo?
About what? I thought I was.
Who are you going to?
I'm talking about queering next.
Okay, you queer away. You're on mute.
I think our segue was that the world is queerer than Aristotle thought. So right. I just want to really quickly, because we are running out of time, say a little bit more about how queer flourishing may be. Now, you may be familiar with the quote from the biologist Haldane, who said the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, it's queerer than we can suppose. I hope we take that really seriously and understand the degree to which we cannot suppose just how queer the larger than human world, including its flourishing, may be. I hope that we reject the error of reprocentrism, which would classify flourishing as getting your genes into the next generation, and we would understand that our desires are much bigger and queerer than that. A biologist who wrote a book called Biological Exuberance, Bruce Bajamil. This is a book which has to do with same-sex attraction, courtship, partnering, pair bonding, and sex among non-human animals. Has a hypothesis that runs sort of like this. The sun shines down more energy than we collectively need every day. And so the flourishes that we do, including queerness, the non-reproductive things that we do, the extra things that we do, are a reflection of that. They don't have to be for something. They are a reflection of the bounteousness of our biosphere. And so I do think that flourishes are queer, and of course the flourishes that many of us queer people do in our speech and in our gestures, often have been scornfully coded as queer. Eros is queer. And I want to suggest to you that caring about the flourishing of others, caring about the flourishing of other animals, at least from the perspective of reprocentrism, is very queer. And so for those of you listening in who have been thinking of yourselves as straight, welcome to the family. And finally, I just want to repeat what I said with regard to queer. I just want to repeat that flourishing happens. Like queerness, flourishing happens with or without us. Flourishing happens, flourishing will happen with or without us. But let's think about how we might be friends of flourishing. Danny and I have some ideas about that, and we definitely want to hear other ideas.
I think we should hear other ideas now. What do you think?
Sure.
I think we were going to invite Dinesh on to help us with the questions. Sorry, I made an executive decision, Patrice. I just got overwhelmed by thinking I was going to spend all the time reading them. So maybe Dinesh can help us a little bit.
Oh, I can't.
Well,
yes,
I've magically appeared
I
again.
can't. I'm sorry to anyone who said anything in the chat for us or for me. My brain is absolutely incapable of reading chats while participating in something like this.
It's completely fine. So I'm happy to ask some questions. And there's been a lively conversation happening in the live stream.
But I would like us, just for the moment, before we move to other things, how can we be friends of flourishing? Like, I'm a sanctuary, we're very practical. Like, I don't want us to leave this session without having some what can we do's articulated.
Let's steer that way. There was a question which I think in fairness, both of you answered, which was the question from Rebecca Hendershot. Do you have any advice about how to help our friends through grief? What methods have you used? What can we do to help while they suffer loss and fear? I think maybe let's, if it's okay, because I think we spent some time talking about this, and I might move to the next question.
Can I actually answer that?
Mm-hmm.
With the one other friend that I was going to introduce, who I brought with me, is Domino, who is at the very bottom. I'm moving out of the way so you can see Domino, who's an alpaca looking down, and there's a sheep looking up. And this is the worst day of that sheep's life. This is a sheep called Shadow, who was rescued by a woman who ran an informal rescue, who was then shot to death by her estranged partner in front of Shadow. And Shadow and her friends, or not her friends, Shadow came to the sanctuary along with a lot of birds who had also lived there. This is moments after she got out of the trailer. She had not lived with other sheep. She had just experienced an unimaginable trauma. The other sheep didn't know what to do with her. She didn't know what to do with them. And an alpaca called Domino walked up, reached down, and she reached up, and they touched noses, and he became her protector. Domino is a friend of flourishing here at the sanctuary. Shadow is not the first grieving animal who Domino has helped. And I've really been asking myself this: how does he do it? How does he do it? How does he make people who are grieving feel comfortable and comforted? And I should say Domino is not neurotypical, so he and I are alike in that way. He helps them with physical care. He rubs, there's physical care, there's physical affection. And many people have said that when he looks you right in the eye, and when he looks at you, it feels like he can see absolutely into your soul, and that he is looking with pure curiosity. There's no presumptions, there's no judgments, he's just curious. about who you might be and what you might want in relation to him. And so I do think that approaching the grief of others as Domino does is at least one answer to that question.
So much, Patrice. What a story. There's a question from Gabriella Burke. Hi, Danielle and Patrice and everyone. Firstly, thank you for this really amazing discussion, which it is. I wanted to ask you how you perceive of flourishing for animals traditionally considered pets. Human domination over these kinds of animals, cats, dogs, budgies, even goldfish, is fundamental to the conditions of their births, lives and deaths. Yet socially they're perceived as being lucky animals because we don't eat them. I'm interested in your thoughts on the discrepancy between human perceptions of pet animals and particularly how we might change the conditions of owning animals to encourage their flourishing.
Do you want to take that, Patrice?
Well, I am thinking, of course, as you probably have guessed, I'm thinking there were until very recently 2 canines here, Trickster and Snowstorm, who had as close as I can imagine to a true flourishing that canines could have, because they were siblings who weren't separated from their parents, and who were out about the sanctuary doing their projects all day long, and then coming into the house at night with me only. And then I'm actually dealing with how to help someone through grief because Storm recently died of bone cancer. Seeing them flourish, seeing them, I almost chose them for as one of the friends to bring here because I think they were flourishing, and they were flourishing specifically because their conditions were different than those of dogs who are kept as pets. One, they weren't separated from their siblings. Almost all of the dogs and cats and other pets have been, and we can't even really imagine what that is like. Next, they had self-determination all day long. They had independent relationships that weren't mediated by like a primary person. Like they had relationships with, and Trickster still does have relationships with lots of different people, all of the sanctuary staff members, many volunteers, many neighbors who walk past and see them, many non-human people, chickens, and so I think it's possible for true flourishing to happen, but at minimum, I think we need to quit separating folks from their families. But then that raises the question, like with the lyrebird and the chainsaw, even in the midst of having been taken from your parents, having been taken from your siblings, being under the control of some other animal, is flourishing possible? And I think it is. The question is like, what are we going to do? How are we going to make it possible?
That's such a comprehensive answer, and I don't want to take away from other questions, but just one language matters, and the first thing we can do linguistically is stop talking about ownership. Just stop talking about ownership. It's not going to change everything, but I think it's such a critical move.
Thanks so much, both. So we've got a quick question, which I think we can resolve quickly. Josephine Brown asks, could I please know where to find the lecture on Utopia that you referred to, Danielle, which I think was Octavia Butler?
Yeah, if you want to send me an email, or if I can send you the reference to it. Yeah, of course.
And then another question, which I think maybe Danny, you might be equipped to answer. And this comes from Emily Major. I was curious what your opinions were about the ideas of flourishing in relation to conservation. They appear to be contrasting ideas, at least if you were to consult mainstream conservation discourses. There are many narratives which position native animals against non-native animals, and these distinctions can sometimes justify unnecessary suffering and cruelty in the name of protection. I have nothing against the flourishing of native species. I want them to thrive. But how does this relate to non-native animals and whether they are deserving of flourishing in similar ways? And Emily also says, many thanks for today. I love hearing about these people that you've introduced today.
Well, I can give a really quick answer, and that's to tune in at 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon when Ariane Wallach and Dan Ramp are going to be giving the keynote conversation. I'm going to be facilitating that. I mean, they're two people who have been really critical in the compassionate conservation movement. And, you know, your observation is that this distinction that human beings have, or some human beings have introduced between animals who belong and animals who don't belong. I'm not denying that there's not historical basis for certain types of relations, belonging in particular environments. And yet these other beings have come to be there, usually through colonialism, through industrial farming, etc. And certainly the idea that they de facto, by virtue of the name that we have given them, don't have a right to flourish, that they are killable, as you know, as Deborah Bird Rose wrote about, is enormously problematic. Right now, with Ariane, I've been working on a case in the Kimberley where they have murdered about 580,000 donkeys over the last 30 years or so. And there's one place up there where the donkeys actually get to live wild and are understood as being contributing members of the community because they help with fire control, they have relationships with everyone else. And the state is absolutely determined to kill those donkeys because they don't belong, because they're in the wrong place. And so I think calling into question the systems of meaning that are built into conservation biology, and Dan and Ariane will speak about this more, is really critical for animal activists and scholars.
Thanks so much. Unfortunately, I think we're about at time. The time has gone past so quickly. There'd been a flood of comments to just thank you both for the kind of stories, the intimate stories that were shared today. And it's obviously resonating with lots of people. There've been a bunch of comments from people who expressed gratitude, Patrice, for welcoming them into the queer family. So the queer community grew over this conversations, which I'm pleased to hear. For those who asked questions that we didn't get to, I'm really sorry that we didn't quite get to it. There's some knockout questions in the live stream chat, which I'll share with Patrice and Danny after the session. So I just wanted to thank Patrice and Danny for everything that you've done today in terms of setting the scene for the conference and sharing actually this really innovative set of stories that I think help to decenter us and put the focus on what do animals want and what does flourishing look like beyond our own concerns. I really appreciate the way that you've done this and the really lovely conversation that you've both engaged in. I wanted to just finally just say that we come back, this is our last session for today. So you might have noticed from the program, we've got a set of kind of half-ish days. And we come back in the second half of the day in Sydney time tomorrow. So we don't start till 3:30 AEDT tomorrow. And part of that is so that we can catch North America and catch Europe and try and do justice to the different people beaming in from different locations. So tomorrow we don't have a keynote conversation till late in the evening, which is David Clough. But we do start with the paper stream sessions. So looking forward to seeing you all at some of those paper presentations, and obviously an opportunity for the delegates themselves through presenting work that you're engaged with. Thanks so much for joining us. We had 91 people on this Zoom session, which is fantastic given that we have 110 registered for the conference, and I know that lots of people zooming in at very odd times. So really pleased to see everybody online today and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.